Rain hammered against the runway hard enough to blur the lights of the private terminal into streaks of gold and silver as Richard Dalton stepped off his jet with the confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. By then, most people in Manhattan already knew his name. Financial magazines called him the king of modern acquisitions. Cable news anchors praised his instincts. Business schools studied his rise from a struggling startup founder in Chicago to the billionaire CEO of Dalton Global Holdings, a corporate empire with investments stretched across hotels, pharmaceuticals, tech firms, and luxury real estate. At 52 years old, Richard had become the kind of man young entrepreneurs quoted online and aging investors fought to shake hands with. But on that stormy October night, none of the cameras waiting outside the Manhattan Grand Regency Hotel were focused on his success. They were focused on the woman walking through the ballroom doors behind him. And within seconds, every powerful man in that room stopped clapping, because the woman Richard Dalton had divorced only 3 months earlier was never supposed to be standing there. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers poured pale gold light over hundreds of guests dressed in black tuxedos and diamond-studded gowns. Senators laughed beside hedge fund managers. Old money families sat beside celebrity investors. Waiters moved through the room carrying glasses of champagne worth more than most Americans spent on groceries in a week. The annual Blackstone Legacy Gala was invitation only, attended by the wealthiest people in the country, and Richard walked through those doors believing the night belonged to him. He shook hands, accepted compliments, smiled for photographs, and barely noticed the orchestra playing softly in the background. At his side stood Jessica Mercer, the woman tabloids had labeled his glamorous new partner after the collapse of his marriage. She was younger than Richard by nearly 20 years, sharp-eyed, beautiful, ambitious, and fully convinced she had secured herself a future beside one of the richest men in America. The two of them looked untouchable together, successful, powerful, untamed. And somewhere in the back of the ballroom, hidden behind velvet curtains and guarded hallways, a woman Richard believed he had erased from his life was waiting for her name to be announced. 3 months earlier, Richard Dalton signed divorce papers with the same emotional detachment he used while approving corporate layoffs. To him, the marriage had become an inconvenience. Olivia Dalton had spent nearly 2 decades standing quietly beside him while he built his empire, but somewhere along the line Richard stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as part of the furniture. Reliable, silent, replaceable. In public interviews, he spoke about sacrifice, ambition, and leadership, but rarely mentioned the woman who stayed awake beside him through bankruptcy scares, investor failures, lawsuits, and panic attacks during the early years of his company. Olivia was never loud enough for his world anymore. She did not care about celebrity parties. She avoided interviews. She hated luxury magazines and social media attention. As Richard's fame grew, Olivia faded further into the background until eventually the tabloids described her as a reclusive housewife. Richard never corrected them. In fact, people close to him later claimed he enjoyed hearing it. The divorce hearing itself lasted less than 2 hours. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic breakdowns, no desperate pleas. Olivia arrived wearing a faded beige cardigan, carrying an old leather purse, looking more like a tired librarian than the wife of a billionaire CEO. Richard arrived with attorneys, assistants, and Jessica seated beside him smiling confidently. According to leaked court documents and interviews from staff members present that day, Richard personally insisted Olivia accept a settlement that included only a used Honda Accord, a small cash payout, and temporary housing support. One anonymous legal assistant later claimed the room became uncomfortable when Richard joked that Olivia would finally have to learn how the real world works. Another witness claimed Jessica laughed quietly after Olivia signed the agreement without arguing. But the detail that would later haunt Richard Dalton forever was not the silence. It was the expression on Olivia's face, because she did not look heartbroken. She did not look angry. If anything, she looked relieved. And now, standing inside the Grand Regency ballroom while billionaire investors applauded the arrival of a mystery guest speaker, Richard finally began noticing something was wrong. The applause around him was changing. At first it sounded polite, expected, ordinary. Then suddenly it became uneven. Scattered whispers moved through the room like electricity underwater. One elderly investor near the front slowly stood up from his chair. Then another. A famous venture capitalist froze with his champagne glass halfway to his lips. Jessica frowned, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, while Richard turned toward the stage with growing irritation. The curtains slowly opened. A woman stepped forward wearing a dark wine-colored gown that shimmered beneath the ballroom lights. Her hair rested neatly over one shoulder. Her posture was calm, controlled, almost cold. And for a brief moment Richard genuinely failed to recognize his own ex-wife. Because the woman standing on that stage did not resemble the quiet housewife he dismissed in court. She looked like someone the room had been waiting for. Then a voice whispered from a nearby table, low, uneasy, shocked, "That's not Olivia Dalton." Richard felt his stomach tighten instantly. Around him, powerful executives began standing one by one. Some looked nervous, others looked deeply uncomfortable. Two men from private security near the ballroom entrance straightened their posture the second they saw her face. Jessica glanced toward Richard searching for answers, but he had none. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO who controlled boardrooms with a single sentence looked completely lost. The woman on stage smiled politely as the applause grew louder. Not dramatic applause, respectful applause. The kind reserved for people whose names opened doors in places money alone could not reach. Richard's fingers loosened around his champagne glass. It slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. Nobody looked down. Nobody cared. Because every eye inside that ballroom was fixed on the woman he believed he had left with nothing. What Richard Dalton did not know was that Olivia had never entered his life by accident. The quiet woman he married 20 years earlier had spent decades hiding a truth so explosive that only a handful of people in America knew it existed. And before the night was over, that hidden truth would trigger federal investigations, destroy billion-dollar partnerships, expose years of corporate deception, and leave one of the most powerful CEOs in the country sitting alone in silence while the empire he built collapsed around him in real time. But to understand why that ballroom froze the second Olivia walked onto that stage, you first have to understand the secret Richard Dalton never bothered to uncover during the entire time he was married to her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time the shattered champagne glass was cleaned from the ballroom floor, Richard Dalton could already feel something slipping beyond his control, though he could not yet explain what it was. The room had changed in a matter of seconds. Moments earlier, he had been the center of attention, moving through crowds of investors and politicians like a man certain of his place in the world. But now conversations were happening around him instead of with him. Men who once chased his approval were staring toward the stage. Women from old money families whispered behind diamond-covered hands, while security personnel positioned themselves near the exits with unusual urgency. Richard watched Olivia standing beneath the chandeliers with the calm composure of someone who belonged there far more than he did. And for the first time since building Dalton Global Holdings, he experienced something unfamiliar. Fear. Not the fear of losing money. Richard had survived financial risks before. This felt different, personal, like he had walked into a room where everyone knew a secret except him. For years, Richard Dalton perfected the image of the self-made billionaire. Business magazines praised him as a visionary who climbed from middle-class obscurity into America's financial elite through relentless ambition and instinct. Television interviews painted him as disciplined, brilliant, and fearless. He told stories about sleeping in his office during the early years of his company, about surviving near bankruptcy, about sacrificing comfort for success. Millions admired him because he represented a fantasy older Americans especially respected. The man who built himself from nothing. Richard understood exactly how to perform that role. He donated to charities, mentored young entrepreneurs publicly, and delivered speeches about perseverance and leadership. But behind closed doors, former employees described another version of him entirely. Executives who worked under Richard later claimed he controlled people through humiliation and intimidation. Several former assistants reportedly signed non-disclosure agreements after explosive arguments inside company offices. One former board member anonymously stated that Richard enjoyed making powerful people feel small because it reminded him he was in control, and nowhere was that side of him more visible than inside his marriage. To the outside world, Olivia Dalton barely existed. During 20 years of marriage, she was photographed beside Richard countless times, yet almost nobody could describe her personality. She rarely gave interviews. She avoided elite social circles whenever possible. At charity events, she often stood quietly behind Richard while investors and reporters ignored her completely. Some people assumed she lacked confidence. Others assumed she simply did not belong in wealthy circles. Jessica Mercer certainly believed that. According to people close to the situation, Jessica often referred to Olivia as the ghost wife because she moved through rooms without drawing attention to herself. Jessica could not understand why Richard had stayed married to someone who seemed so ordinary. To her, Olivia looked tired, emotionally distant, and disconnected from the glamorous lifestyle surrounding Dalton Global Holdings. Jessica represented everything Olivia appeared not to be: confident, stylish, social, hungry for status. She understood how wealthy people spoke, where they vacationed, what they drank, and which names mattered in elite circles. By the time Richard filed for divorce, Jessica already imagined herself replacing Olivia permanently, stepping into the life she believed the older woman had failed to appreciate. But even during the divorce hearing itself, strange details began surfacing around Olivia that nobody fully understood at the time. Several witnesses later recalled noticing unfamiliar men positioned outside the courthouse entrance. One reporter claimed a black SUV waited across the street for nearly the entire hearing. Another witness remembered seeing a man with a professional camera photographing Olivia repeatedly as she entered and exited the building, though none of the images ever appeared in tabloids or media coverage afterward. At first, people assumed the photographer worked for celebrity gossip outlets following Richard's divorce scandal. But when investigators later reviewed courthouse surveillance footage, they discovered something unsettling. The photographer never took pictures of Richard. Every photograph focused exclusively on Olivia, her facial expressions, her hands, the documents she carried, even the moment she paused briefly beside the courthouse steps before entering the waiting SUV. Someone had been documenting her movements carefully, deliberately, almost as if preparing for something much larger than a divorce settlement. The identity of the person who hired that photographer would remain hidden for months, and when the truth finally surfaced, it would completely change the way people understood Olivia Dalton's entire marriage. Inside the ballroom, Richard's confusion deepened as more influential guests began approaching Olivia with visible respect. One elderly banker from Boston shook her hand with both of his, lowering his head slightly in a gesture Richard had never seen him offer anyone. A powerful Texas oil executive who once rejected Richard during a merger negotiation suddenly crossed the room to greet Olivia personally. Jessica noticed it too. Her expression slowly shifted from irritation to genuine concern, because wealthy people did not behave this way toward ordinary women, especially not women Richard described publicly as emotionally fragile and financially dependent after the divorce. None of it made sense. Richard replayed the past 3 months repeatedly in his head, searching for explanations. He remembered Olivia leaving the courthouse carrying nothing except a purse and a cardboard document box. He remembered the silence in the elevator afterward. He remembered feeling satisfied, convinced he had finally removed the quiet burden standing beside him for years. Yet now, watching billionaires straighten their posture in Olivia's presence, Richard felt a terrifying realization beginning to form beneath the surface of his thoughts. He had never actually known his wife at all. And the deeper investigators would eventually dig into Olivia's past, the stranger the story became. There were unexplained gaps in her public records before her marriage. College archives connected to her background appeared partially sealed. Financial analysts later uncovered traces of private trusts connected to offshore accounts dating back decades before she ever met Richard. Even her maiden name became difficult to trace through normal databases, almost as if pieces of her history had been intentionally hidden from public access. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was this. Several people inside Dalton Global Holdings already seemed aware that Olivia was dangerous long before Richard divorced her. Former executives later admitted that certain employees became visibly nervous whenever Olivia visited company headquarters unexpectedly. One former legal consultant even claimed Richard's senior staff referred to her privately as the silent auditor because she noticed details other people missed. Yet Richard himself ignored every warning sign. He saw her silence as weakness. He mistook emotional control for helplessness. And now, standing beneath the gold lights of the Grand Regency Ballroom, while whispers spread through crowds of America's wealthiest elites, Richard Dalton was beginning to understand the possibility that terrified him most. He had not divorced an invisible woman. He had challenged someone far more powerful than he ever imagined possible. Long before Richard Dalton became the kind of billionaire who arrived at galas through private airport terminals and shook hands with senators beneath chandelier light, he was just another exhausted entrepreneur trying to survive in a cramped Chicago apartment with overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter. In those days, there were no magazine covers, no luxury penthouses, no television interviews praising his genius. Dalton Global Holdings did not yet exist. Richard had only a collapsing tech logistics startup, a second-hand laptop, and an ambition so consuming it left him awake most nights packing across stained apartment floors, rehearsing investor pitches to himself. Friends who knew him then described him as intense but unfocused, driven but reckless. He chased opportunities constantly, often changing business directions overnight whenever he spotted potential profit. Several early investors later admitted they nearly abandoned him because he lacked discipline. The one person who never walked away during those years was Olivia. Richard met Olivia at a financial compliance seminar in downtown Chicago nearly 23 years earlier. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic about her. She dressed simply, spoke carefully, and rarely volunteered personal information. While other people networked aggressively after presentations, Olivia usually stayed near the back of the room quietly observing conversations instead of joining them. Richard almost ignored her entirely until one night after the seminar ended, when she calmly corrected a flaw in one of his expansion projections after overhearing him speaking with another investor. According to Richard himself during an old interview years later, Olivia pointed out an accounting inconsistency that would have bankrupted his company within 6 months if left unresolved. What struck him was not only that she caught the mistake immediately, but that she explained the solution faster than his own financial advisors had managed to. Richard later laughed during that interview and said, "I married the smartest person in the room before anyone else realized it." At the time, he meant it as admiration. Years later, those words would sound almost tragic. During the early years of their marriage, Olivia became deeply involved in helping Richard stabilize his struggling business, though almost nobody outside their apartment knew the extent of her involvement. While Richard handled investors and public meetings, Olivia quietly organized operational structures behind the scenes. She rewrote contracts, reviewed compliance risks, identified financial leaks, and often stayed awake beside Richard until sunrise helping him prepare presentations before major investor meetings. Former employees from Dalton Global's earliest days later admitted Olivia solved problems inside the company constantly without ever demanding recognition. One former accountant recalled discovering that Olivia had personally prevented a catastrophic tax filing error that could have triggered federal investigations during the company's second year. Another early employee claimed Richard frequently entered meetings with solutions Olivia had developed hours earlier in private conversations at home. Yet publicly, the praise always belonged to Richard. Investors called him visionary. Reporters described him as brilliant. Olivia remained almost invisible beside him, quietly watching her husband absorb admiration built partly on her intelligence. For a long time, Richard genuinely appeared grateful. Old photographs from the first years of their marriage show a different version of him entirely. Less polished, less guarded. There are images of Richard and Olivia eating takeout on office floors during overnight work sessions, laughing inside empty conference rooms after failed investor pitches, holding each other during moments when Dalton Global nearly collapsed financially. Former friends described them as unusually connected, almost operating like two halves of the same machine. Olivia handled pressure with eerie calm, while Richard thrived on momentum and persuasion. Together, they balanced each other. But wealth changes certain people slowly, almost invisibly at first, and Richard Dalton began changing the moment powerful men started treating him like he belonged among them. The first warning signs appeared subtly. Expensive watches, private clubs, invitations to elite parties where billionaires discussed acquisitions over whiskey and cigars, while their wives posed for photographs nearby. Richard became fascinated with status. Once he finally gained access to rooms he spent his entire life dreaming about. Former colleagues later claimed he developed an obsession with appearing powerful at all times. He started correcting waiters harshly in restaurants. He mocked smaller competitors publicly during interviews. He became increasingly impatient with employees who disagreed with him. And somewhere during that transformation, he also began distancing himself from Olivia. At first, it sounded harmless. Small jokes during business dinners about how Olivia preferred staying out of serious conversations. Comments about her not understanding modern expansion strategy. Investors laughed politely. Olivia never reacted. But over time, the dismissiveness grew sharper, more deliberate. Richard stopped bringing her to certain events entirely. When reporters asked about his marriage, he redirected conversations back toward business success. In private, he became increasingly secretive. By the 10th year of Dalton Global's rise, Richard had developed habits Olivia noticed immediately but rarely confronted directly. Financial documents disappeared from shared office spaces. Passwords changed without explanation. Late-night meetings appeared on his schedule without company records attached to them. Olivia also noticed unusual transfers between shell subsidiaries connected to Dalton Global Holdings, though whenever she questioned Richard, he brushed the concerns aside impatiently. According to people close to the marriage, Richard often accused Olivia of worrying too much about technical details instead of appreciating how successful their lives had become. But Olivia never stopped paying attention. Quietly, without informing Richard, she began documenting inconsistencies inside the company herself. That was when the strange habits started. Several years before the divorce, Olivia reportedly purchased an encrypted hard drive using cash from a small electronics store outside Manhattan. A former household employee later claimed Olivia spent certain nights locked inside Richard's home office long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Another staff member remembered hearing Olivia speaking softly on late-night phone calls that ended abruptly whenever someone entered the room. Then there was the family crest. According to testimony later uncovered during federal investigations, Olivia kept an antique silver emblem hidden inside the back compartment of an old wooden desk drawer in their home library. The crest displayed a symbol almost nobody recognized at the time, a crown-shaped insignia wrapped around a Latin phrase connected to one of America's oldest private banking dynasties. Richard apparently saw the object several times over the years, but never questioned it seriously. Like so many things involving Olivia, he stopped looking closely because he assumed he already understood her completely. But Olivia was also changing during those years, though in ways Richard completely failed to notice. The quiet patience she once used to support his ambitions slowly transformed into careful observation. She copied files discreetly, stored financial records, archived internal emails. Some investigators later believed Olivia began preparing for something long before Richard ever filed for divorce. The question that haunted federal prosecutors years later was simple. Was Olivia gathering evidence because she suspected criminal activity inside Dalton Global Holdings, or because she already knew exactly what Richard had become? Even more unsettling was the possibility that Olivia's true identity, the secret now causing billionaires inside the Grand Regency ballroom to stand respectfully in her presence, connected directly to why she married Richard in the first place. And while Richard chased magazine covers and billionaire status across New York, Olivia continued watching quietly from the shadows of his empire, collecting fragments of a truth that would eventually destroy him. Because hidden deep inside the encrypted files she protected so carefully were records capable of exposing deals powerful men spent years trying to keep buried. Richard Dalton believed his greatest mistake was underestimating his wife during the divorce. But the truth was far worse than that. His greatest mistake was assuming Olivia Dalton had ever truly been powerless at all. By the time Richard Dalton met Jessica Mercer, Dalton Global Holdings had already become one of the fastest-growing investment corporations in the country. Richard was no longer the exhausted entrepreneur eating takeout beside Olivia in cramped apartments. He now lived inside a world built entirely around wealth, exclusivity, and attention. Manhattan restaurants closed private rooms for him without notice. Luxury hotels upgraded his suites automatically. Business podcasts described him as one of the most influential corporate minds in America. And somewhere during that rise, Richard developed a dangerous addiction that had nothing to do with money. He became addicted to admiration. People who knew him closely later claimed Richard no longer entered rooms hopping to connect with others. He entered rooms expecting to dominate them. Jessica Mercer understood that immediately the first night they met. Jessica worked as a public relations strategist hired temporarily during one of Dalton Global's aggressive expansion campaigns into luxury hospitality. She was sharp, observant, and exceptionally skilled at making powerful men feel more important than they really were. Unlike Olivia, Jessica thrived in elite environments. She understood how to flatter investors without appearing desperate, and how to make wealthy executives feel intellectually superior during conversations. Richard was drawn to her almost instantly because Jessica reflected back the version of himself he desperately wanted the world to believe in. Visionary, unstoppable, extraordinary. According to several former Dalton Global employees, Jessica quickly became a constant presence around Richard during company events, investor dinners, and private meetings. At first, rumors about the relationship remained quiet. But inside executive circles, people noticed changes in Richard almost immediately. He started dressing younger, speaking differently, smiling more around cameras. One former assistant later admitted Jessica constantly encouraged Richard to see himself as too important for the quiet domestic life Olivia represented. Olivia noticed the affair long before Richard admitted it openly. The signs were painfully obvious. Unexplained trips, midnight text messages hidden beneath conference tables, sudden business meetings scheduled on weekends. Richard stopped trying to hide the emotional distance between them because, by then, he no longer believed he needed to. Jessica slowly inserted herself deeper into Richard's personal life with calculated precision. According to insiders close to the family, she often made subtle comments about Olivia during social events disguised as harmless observations. She would joke about Olivia disappearing early from parties or laugh quietly about her small-town energy. Whenever elite guests discussed fashion, travel, or politics. Most people ignored the comments because Olivia herself never reacted publicly. She simply watched, listened, observed. That silence only encouraged Jessica further. She interpreted Olivia's restraint as weakness instead of discipline. Richard eventually stopped pretending the marriage still mattered. During one charity dinner in Manhattan, several guests reportedly witnessed Jessica sitting beside Richard openly, while Olivia remained seated alone at the opposite end of the table. One witness later described the atmosphere as humiliating beyond words. Another recalled Richard speaking about future travel plans with Jessica, while Olivia quietly continued eating without interruption. It became increasingly clear that Richard wanted Olivia to feel invisible inside her own marriage. According to leaked accounts from former household employees, Richard and Jessica even began discussing renovation plans for Richard's penthouse before the divorce papers were officially filed. Olivia overheard some of those conversations herself, yet somehow she remained unnervingly calm through all of it. No screaming arguments, no public confrontations, no emotional breakdowns. And strangely, that calmness began unsettling people around her more than anger would have. The divorce hearing finally took place on a gray February morning inside a corporate law office overlooking downtown Manhattan. The room itself felt cold enough to resemble a bank vault more than a place where 20 years of marriage would officially end. Floor to ceiling, windows framed the city skyline behind Richard as he sat confidently beside his attorneys wearing a charcoal suit and silver watch worth more than most Americans earned in a year. Jessica sat several feet behind him dressed in white, occasionally whispering comments into his ear, while Olivia remained alone across the table carrying only a leather folder and a cup of untouched coffee. Witnesses later described Olivia as emotionally unreadable that morning. Not defeated, not angry, almost detached, like someone attending a meeting whose outcome she already knew in advance. Richard controlled the conversation from the beginning. He spoke to Olivia less like a former wife and more like a failed employee being removed from a company restructuring. According to leaked transcripts later obtained by investigative reporters, Richard repeatedly emphasized that Olivia contributed little to Dalton Global's public success. He described himself as the architect of the empire, while portraying Olivia as someone who merely benefited from standing beside him. At one point during the hearing, Richard reportedly leaned back in his chair and said words several witnesses would later repeat publicly during interviews. "You were lucky to stand beside me." The room reportedly went silent afterward. Even one of Richard's own attorneys appeared uncomfortable, but Richard continued speaking. He called Olivia emotionally distant, claimed she lacked ambition, suggested she never understood the pressure of leadership. Then came the settlement offer. A used Honda Accord, $10,000, temporary housing assistance, nothing more. For a woman married to a billionaire CEO for nearly 2 decades, the offer felt less like a settlement and more like humiliation performed deliberately in front of witnesses. Jessica reportedly smiled faintly when the numbers were presented. One legal assistant later admitted she expected Olivia to finally break emotionally at that moment. But Olivia never cried. Not once. She never raised her voice, never begged, never defended herself. And somehow, that silence became more disturbing than rage. Richard seemed irritated by it too, as though part of him wanted emotional chaos because it would confirm his belief that Olivia was weak and dependent. Instead, she simply reviewed the documents carefully page by page while the room waited. Then something strange happened. After nearly 15 minutes of complete silence, Olivia reached the final section of the agreement, paused briefly, and looked directly toward Richard for the first time since entering the office. Her expression remained calm, controlled, precise. "Make sure page 6 is included." According to multiple witnesses, Richard barely reacted. Distracted by Jessica whispering beside him and eager to finish the proceedings quickly, he waved dismissively toward his attorneys without reviewing the document again. The hearing ended minutes later. At the time, Nobody inside that room understood why Olivia specifically mentioned page 6. But years later, investigators, journalists, and federal prosecutors would all become obsessed with the same question. What exactly was hidden inside that page Richard Dalton ignored so carelessly? As Olivia stood to leave the office, several people noticed another detail that felt strangely out of place. Through the glass windows overlooking the street below, a black SUV had been waiting outside the building for nearly the entire hearing. Two men in dark suits stood beside the vehicle near the entrance despite the freezing February rain. They did not behave like chauffeurs. They behaved like security personnel. One employee later claimed the men opened the SUV door for Olivia with visible formality the second she stepped outside, almost as though they were greeting someone important rather than assisting a recently divorced woman supposedly left with nothing. Richard either failed to notice or simply did not care. By then, he was already celebrating privately with Jessica, convinced the most inconvenient chapter of his life had finally ended. But high above Manhattan, while rain slid across the windows of the law office Richard Dalton believed he controlled, Olivia Dalton disappeared into the back seat of that waiting SUV carrying documents that would eventually dismantle everything he spent 20 years building. And hidden somewhere inside those papers was page 6. The same page Richard ignored. The same page Olivia insisted remain untouched. The same page that would later become one of the most expensive mistakes in billionaire corporate history. 3 weeks after the divorce papers were finalized, Richard Dalton walked into the 42nd floor executive conference room at Dalton Global Holdings, expecting another ordinary Monday strategy meeting. Instead, he found 6 senior board members sitting in complete silence staring at printed financial reports spread across the glass table like evidence from a crime scene. According to former executives who later spoke anonymously about that morning, the atmosphere felt tense enough to stop conversation entirely the second Richard entered the room. One board member reportedly asked why nearly $12 million had moved through a Cayman Islands subsidiary no one recognized. Another questioned irregular transfers connected to a pharmaceutical acquisition in Singapore. Richard dismissed the concerns quickly, blaming accounting delays and temporary restructuring complications. Publicly, he remained calm. Internally, however, something unsettled him immediately. Because those transactions were supposed to be invisible outside a very small circle of trusted executives. Yet somehow people were beginning to ask questions anyway. At almost the exact same time, Olivia Dalton sat alone inside a private office several miles away, reviewing encrypted files, copied from Dalton Global servers over a period spanning nearly 8 years. Investigators later discovered that Olivia had quietly assembled one of the most extensive collections of corporate financial evidence ever connected to a private American investment firm. The files included offshore account transfers, shell company registrations, falsified investor statements, and confidential internal communications tied to acquisitions that federal analysts would later describe as deeply irregular. But the most unsettling part of the investigation was not the evidence itself. It was the timeline. Olivia began gathering documents years before the divorce ever happened, long before Jessica Mercer entered Richard's life publicly, long before federal agencies noticed suspicious movement surrounding Dalton Global Holdings, which raised a disturbing possibility investigators struggled to answer for months afterward. Was Olivia secretly protecting Richard from dangerous people inside his company, or had she been building a case against her own husband all along? As journalists later reconstructed the timeline surrounding Dalton Global's collapse, several strange incidents began attracting national attention. Financial news networks replayed archived interviews where Richard confidently denied accusations of aggressive accounting manipulation. Independent analysts released charts showing unusual patterns between Dalton Global acquisitions and anonymous offshore transfers tied to shell corporations in Luxembourg, Panama, and the British Virgin Islands. A leaked SEC briefing circulated online claiming regulators quietly opened preliminary inquiries into several Dalton Global subsidiaries nearly 2 years before the divorce became public. Then came the emails. According to investigative reports published months later, anonymous sources leaked hundreds of internal Dalton Global communications to financial reporters shortly after the gala at the Grand Regency Hotel. Some messages revealed executives discussing hidden liabilities connected to overseas investments. Others referenced temporary balance sheet masking ahead of investor meetings. One email sent from a senior financial officer warned that continued transfers through offshore channels could expose the company to federal scrutiny if discovered externally. The message ended with a chilling sentence investigators would quote repeatedly during later hearings. "If Olivia ever sees these numbers, we are finished." Nobody outside Dalton Global understood what that line truly meant at the time. But people close to Richard later admitted hearing rumors for years that Olivia possessed a frightening ability to uncover inconsistencies hidden deep inside company operations. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger Olivia's behavior during the final years of the marriage appeared. Records later showed repeated encrypted communications between Olivia and unidentified contacts connected to international banking firms. There were late-night phone calls routed through private servers in Geneva, mysterious document transfers stored under anonymous digital accounts. One former cybersecurity consultant hired briefly by Dalton Global claimed he discovered traces of unauthorized file duplication originating from Richard's own executive network, but was abruptly removed from the project before completing his audit. Years later, federal investigators would quietly confirm that large portions of Dalton Global's internal financial archives had been copied long before Richard filed for divorce. Someone inside the company had been helping Olivia access protected information for years. But who? That question became one of the biggest mysteries surrounding the entire case. Because Olivia could not have gathered that level of evidence alone. Certain files required executive clearance. Others were stored in secure systems accessible only to senior financial officers and legal departments. Somewhere inside Richard Dalton's empire, someone was secretly feeding information directly to Olivia while pretending loyalty to Richard publicly. And whoever that person was, they understood Dalton Global's deepest vulnerabilities intimately enough to expose them piece by piece, without triggering immediate suspicion. Meanwhile, Richard himself remained dangerously unaware of how serious the situation was becoming. At first, the warning signs seemed small enough to dismiss. Missing reports, delayed audits, files removed from shared drives without explanation. Then entire financial accounts connected to offshore entities began disappearing from internal summaries altogether. During one closed-door executive meeting, a senior board member reportedly confronted Richard about discrepancies involving international revenue projections that no longer matched archived records from previous quarters. Another executive questioned why outside investors suddenly requested emergency reviews of multiple acquisitions finalized years earlier. Richard reacted aggressively, accusing his staff of incompetence and paranoia. According to one former executive, Richard became increasingly obsessed with identifying disloyalty inside the company while still refusing to believe Olivia posed any genuine threat. To him, she remained the quiet ex-wife living alone with a used Honda and a modest settlement agreement. But the paranoia inside Dalton Global continued growing. Employees noticed security protocols changing weekly. Richard demanded tighter access restrictions around financial departments. Several longtime executives resigned unexpectedly within a single month. Investors who once trusted Richard unquestioningly began requesting independent audits before approving future deals. Anonymous financial bloggers published speculative reports connecting Dalton Global to hidden shell corporations overseas. Cable business networks debated whether the company's explosive growth during the past decade had been artificially inflated through concealed debt structures. Each story increased pressure further. And still, behind the scenes, Olivia continued gathering evidence silently while remaining completely absent from public view. Then another disturbing detail surfaced. According to private airport records later obtained during investigations, Olivia traveled repeatedly under sealed arrangements to locations connected to private banking institutions across Europe during the final years of her marriage. Zurich, Geneva, Luxembourg. At least once, records suggest she met privately with representatives connected to one of America's oldest financial dynasties. The same dynasty tied mysteriously to the antique family crest hidden for years inside her desk drawer. The same crest Richard ignored whenever he saw it. Suddenly, the questions surrounding Olivia stopped sounding personal and started sounding dangerous. Because if Olivia truly belonged to the kind of family powerful enough to move silently through international banking systems without public visibility, then Richard Dalton may not have simply underestimated his wife. He may have unknowingly built parts of his empire directly under the observation of people far wealthier and more connected than he ever realized existed. And while Richard fought desperately to maintain control of Dalton Global Holdings, another clock was already ticking toward the night of the Blackstone Legacy Gala. Toward the moment Olivia would walk onto that stage beneath the ballroom lights, while billionaires rose silently to their feet. Toward the moment Richard Dalton's world would fracture in front of everyone who once admired him. Because hidden somewhere inside the evidence Olivia collected was one final truth powerful enough to freeze an entire room the second her real name was spoken aloud. By the night of the Blackstone Legacy Gala, Manhattan looked like a city polished for royalty. Rainwater reflected gold across crowded streets, while black SUVs lined the entrance of the Grand Regency Hotel beneath towering marble columns wrapped in light. News crews gathered behind velvet barricades, hopping to capture images of senators, celebrities, hedge fund billionaires, and corporate titans arriving for one of the most exclusive financial gatherings in America. Invitations to the gala were nearly impossible to obtain unless your name carried influence powerful enough to move markets or shape governments. Inside the hotel ballroom, crystal chandeliers hung overhead like floating constellations, while a live orchestra played softly beneath conversations worth billions of dollars. Waiters moved carefully through crowds carrying champagne imported from private French estates, as media photographers flashed cameras toward every recognizable face entering the room. It was the kind of environment Richard Dalton once dreamed about during sleepless nights inside his cramped Chicago apartment years earlier. And on that night, he walked into the ballroom believing he had finally reached the absolute peak of his life. Richard arrived dressed in a tailored black tuxedo beside Jessica Mercer, who looked radiant beneath the gold lighting pouring across the marble floors. The two of them moved confidently through the crowd, while investors greeted Richard warmly and reporters called his name from behind camera lines. Only weeks earlier, several financial magazines predicted Dalton Global Holdings was preparing for its most profitable expansion yet. Despite rumors of internal instability and growing investor concerns, Richard remained publicly untouchable. Even now, surrounded by America's financial elite, he carried himself like a man who fully expected admiration the second he entered a room. Jessica mirrored that confidence perfectly. Witnesses later described her smiling constantly that evening, almost as if she viewed the gala as confirmation that she had successfully replaced Olivia in every meaningful way. She spoke easily with investors, laughed beside politicians, and stood proudly beside Richard while cameras captured photographs destined for newspapers the next morning. Neither of them noticed how strangely certain people inside the ballroom behaved whenever Olivia's name surfaced quietly in conversation. Several executives reportedly arrived at the gala already aware something unusual was about to happen. According to later interviews, invitations had been altered unexpectedly less than 48 hours before the event. Security protocols were expanded without explanation. A handful of influential guests from old banking families appeared on the attendee list despite rarely participating in modern corporate functions. One Wall Street executive later admitted he immediately sensed tension inside the room the moment he arrived, because several people who normally dominated conversations seemed distracted, almost nervous. Yet Richard ignored every warning sign completely. He continued moving through the ballroom shaking hands confidently while discussing future acquisitions and investment opportunities with billionaire partners. To him, the night represented another victory lap, another opportunity to reinforce his image as one of the most powerful, self-made businessmen in America. He still believed Olivia Dalton had disappeared quietly into irrelevance after the divorce. Then the lights dimmed. At first, the transition seemed routine. The orchestra softened. Conversations lowered gradually. Guests turned toward the massive stage positioned beneath towering chandeliers at the far end of the ballroom. A respected financial commentator stepped toward the microphone and welcomed everyone officially to the annual Blackstone Legacy Gala before beginning introductions for the evening's keynote address. Richard barely listened initially. He continued whispering something into Jessica's ear while lifting a champagne glass casually toward a nearby investor. But then the announcer paused unexpectedly. The ballroom grew completely silent. Tonight's keynote speaker. Another pause. Evelyn Van Alder. The effect inside the room was immediate and almost impossible to describe. Several elderly billionaires near the front table stood up instantly before anyone else reacted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence across the ballroom. One senator reportedly lowered his glass so suddenly it spilled across the tablecloth unnoticed. Security personnel positioned near the stage straightened visibly, their entire posture shifting with military precision. Richard's smile disappeared almost instantly. Jessica frowned beside him and whispered quietly, "Who's that?" Richard never answered, because at that exact moment, a woman stepped onto the stage beneath the golden chandelier light, and the entire ballroom erupted into applause so powerful it echoed against the marble walls like thunder. Olivia, or rather, the woman Richard Dalton believed was Olivia. Gone was the quiet wife hidden for years behind soft cardigans and silence at charity dinners. Gone was the emotionally restrained woman dismissed publicly during divorce proceedings only months earlier. The woman standing beneath the ballroom lights looked composed, elegant, and impossibly powerful. She wore a dark wine-colored gown that shimmered subtly as she walked toward the microphone with absolute confidence. Her posture was calm, controlled, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Richard stared upward in complete disbelief, while Jessica's expression slowly shifted from confusion into panic. Then came the words that shattered the entire illusion surrounding Richard Dalton's marriage forever. "Please welcome Evelyn Olivia Van Alder." The room exploded again. Not polite applause. Respect. The kind reserved for names woven deeply into the foundations of American financial power. Investigative journalists would later spend months explaining to the public exactly who the Van Alders were, because most ordinary Americans had never heard the name before that night. Unlike celebrity billionaires who appeared constantly on magazine covers and television interviews, the Van Alder family operated almost entirely outside public attention. Their wealth stretched back generations into private banking, wartime industrial financing, international investment trusts, and elite private equity institutions connected quietly to some of the most powerful financial networks in the Western world. Financial historians later compared the family to hidden dynasties that shaped American capitalism from behind closed doors for over a century. They avoided publicity deliberately. No reality shows, no public scandals, no interviews. Just influence. Massive, silent influence hidden behind foundations, investment groups, and private holdings most people never connected together publicly. And standing beneath the chandeliers, that night was one of the direct heirs to that empire. Richard felt all the air leave his body. Suddenly memories began replaying violently inside his mind. The antique crest hidden in Olivia's drawer, the encrypted files, the mysterious phone calls routed overseas, the security personnel outside the divorce hearing, the black SUV waiting in the rain, the way powerful executives sometimes acted strangely around Olivia without explanation. Every ignored detail now slammed together at once with terrifying clarity. He had spent 20 years married to one of the wealthiest and most connected women in America, without ever understanding who she truly was. Even worse, many people around him apparently knew. Richard watched in stunned silence as CEOs approached the stage respectfully. Politicians lined up personally to shake Olivia's hand. Billionaire investors nodded toward her with visible deference. Security personnel who barely acknowledged Richard earlier now treated Olivia with unmistakable priority. Jessica stood frozen beside him, visibly pale beneath the ballroom lighting, realizing the woman she mocked privately for years belonged to a level of wealth and power far beyond anything either of them truly understood. And still, Olivia remained calm. No anger, no dramatic revenge speech, no emotional explosion. That composure frightened Richard more than rage ever could, because it meant this moment had been planned carefully. Every second, every reveal, every detail. Then Olivia finally stepped closer toward the microphone while the ballroom settled into complete silence once again. She looked across the crowd slowly, her eyes briefly finding Richard standing motionless near the center of the room. Witnesses later claimed Richard looked physically shaken for the first time anyone could remember, like a man realizing his entire understanding of reality had been false. Olivia spoke softly. "There's one more thing the board deserves to know." And somewhere deep inside the Grand Regency ballroom, several executives immediately lowered their heads as if they already understood exactly what was about to happen next. The silence inside the Grand Regency ballroom after Olivia's final sentence felt heavier than the applause that came before it. Hundreds of wealthy guests remained frozen beneath the chandeliers, while camera flashes flickered softly across the room like distant lightning. Richard Dalton stood perfectly still near the center of the ballroom, his face drained of color, trying desperately to understand how the quiet woman he dismissed during a divorce hearing had transformed into the most powerful presence in the room within a matter of minutes. Jessica Mercer looked equally shaken beside him, though unlike Richard, her fear was becoming visible. Her eyes moved anxiously between Olivia and the executives seated near the front tables, as though she suddenly realized she had walked unknowingly into a war already decided long before tonight began. Olivia rested one hand lightly against the podium and looked across the ballroom with astonishing calm. No trembling voice, no bitterness, no emotional satisfaction. That restraint unsettled the room more than rage ever could because powerful people understood something ordinary audiences often miss. Truly dangerous individuals rarely lose control publicly. And at that moment, Olivia looked entirely in control. "For the last 7 years," she began quietly, "Dalton Global Holdings has concealed financial liabilities through offshore shell entities connected to unreported debt structures in Luxembourg, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands." Several executives lowered their heads instantly. Others froze. Richard's heartbeat visibly accelerated. Olivia continued speaking with the same measured tone someone might use while reading weather forecasts. Internal earnings reports shown to investors were altered repeatedly prior to quarterly filings. Multiple acquisitions approved by Dalton Global were funded using concealed liabilities transferred through subsidiary corporations, designed specifically to avoid federal disclosure requirements. The ballroom erupted into whispers. One investor near the front reportedly stood up and demanded clarification immediately, while several journalists positioned near the rear exits began sending messages frantically from their phones. Across the ballroom, Richard's attorneys exchanged panicked looks with board members who suddenly appeared unable to make eye contact with one another. Jessica stepped backward slightly, as though instinctively trying to create distance between herself and Richard without drawing attention to it. Then Olivia delivered the sentence that shattered the room completely. Federal investigators have already received the supporting documentation. Absolute chaos followed. People began standing all at once. Conversations exploded across the ballroom in overlapping waves of confusion and panic. Financial reporters rushed toward exits trying to contact newsrooms before competitors published the story first. Several investors stormed directly toward Dalton Global executives, demanding explanations, while security personnel moved quickly toward restricted areas near the stage. Richard remained motionless through all of it, staring upward at Olivia with a level of disbelief that bordered on paralysis. Because as horrifying as the accusations sounded publicly, Richard understood something far worse privately. The documents existed, every single one, and only a tiny handful of people inside Dalton Global Holdings ever had access to all of them. Behind Olivia, enormous digital screens positioned beside the stage suddenly illuminated with charts, financial timelines, and transaction records linked directly to Dalton Global subsidiaries. The ballroom filled with graphics showing billions of dollars transferred through offshore structures hidden from investors for years. Red arrows connected shell corporations across multiple countries, while projected debt figures revealed enormous concealed liabilities buried beneath Dalton Global's public financial image. Gasps echoed through the room as financial analysts in attendance recognized the implications instantly. Dalton Global Holdings was not simply unstable, it was potentially catastrophic. Within minutes, phones across the ballroom began vibrating simultaneously. Breaking news alerts flooded financial media networks. Dalton Global under investigation. Massive corporate fraud, ALLEGATIONS, emerge. Billionaire CEO Richard Dalton accused of hiding billions in debt. Several investors reportedly left the ballroom immediately without speaking to anyone. One hedge fund executive later admitted his firm began liquidating Dalton Global positions before Olivia even finished speaking. Television screens near the bar area switched suddenly from gala coverage to emergency financial broadcasts showing Dalton Global stock collapsing in after-hours trading. Numbers plunged violently downward, while commentators struggled to explain the scale of the unfolding disaster in real time. Richard watched billions disappear from his empire minute by minute beneath flashing red graphics displayed across national television networks. And still Olivia never raised her voice. That calmness terrified people, because it became increasingly obvious she was not improvising emotionally in response to betrayal. She had prepared every detail with surgical precision. Then came the second shock. As federal agents entered Dalton Global headquarters downtown later that same evening carrying sealed warrants, another revelation surfaced behind the scenes. The anonymous insider secretly feeding Olivia financial information for years was not a low-level employee, not a disgruntled assistant, not a hacker. It was Richard's own chief financial officer, Daniel Mercer, Jessica's older brother. The revelation spread through executive circles like a detonation. According to investigators later involved in the case, Daniel Mercer initially remained fiercely loyal to Richard for years, while helping structure Dalton Global's aggressive expansion strategies. But internal tensions reportedly exploded after Richard began shifting hidden liabilities toward divisions Daniel personally supervised, effectively positioning him as the fall guy if federal scrutiny ever emerged. Several leaked emails later revealed Daniel privately warning Richard multiple times that the company's concealed debt structures were becoming dangerously unsustainable. Richard ignored him repeatedly. Worse, he reportedly blamed Daniel directly whenever board members questioned irregular financial activity internally. Then Daniel discovered something even more alarming. Richard planned to quietly remove him after the next quarterly reporting cycle. That betrayal changed everything. Investigators later concluded Daniel began secretly communicating with Olivia nearly 3 years before the divorce. At first, he allegedly believed Olivia was helping protect Richard from catastrophic exposure. But over time, their communications evolved into something far more dangerous. Together, they assembled evidence documenting years of hidden transactions, falsified reports, offshore debt concealment, and potentially illegal acquisition strategies buried beneath Dalton Global's public success story. Suddenly, the strange pieces surrounding Olivia's behavior started fitting together perfectly. The encrypted hard drive, the late-night calls, the copied files, the silent observation, the mysterious meetings overseas. And finally, page 6. Because buried deep inside the divorce agreement, Richard signed carelessly without review was a clause granting Olivia temporary rights to independent internal audit access, connected to several shared marital investment entities, tied indirectly to Dalton Global Holdings. Richard ignored it entirely during the hearing because he believed Olivia lacked the intelligence, influence, or courage to challenge him legally. But page 6 changed everything. That single overlooked clause gave Olivia just enough legal visibility into internal financial records to finalize the evidence she needed without triggering immediate suspicion. The realization hit Richard all at once while the ballroom collapsed into panic around him. Olivia had not reacted emotionally during the divorce because the divorce itself was never the real battle. It was bait. Every humiliating comment, every insult, every moment he underestimated her, every time Jessica mocked her quietly. Olivia absorbed all of it because she already knew exactly how the story would end. And now, standing beneath the chandeliers while billionaires abandoned Dalton Global in real time, Richard Dalton finally understood the horrifying truth too late. He had not destroyed Olivia Dalton. Olivia Dalton had dismantled him patiently from inside his own empire, while he smiled beside another woman believing he had already won. By midnight, the Grand Regency ballroom barely resembled the glittering financial paradise it had been only hours earlier. Half-empty champagne glasses remained abandoned across tables where billionaires once laughed confidently beside camera crews and politicians. Investors rushed through hotel corridors, speaking urgently into phones, while legal advisors disappeared into private elevators with expressions that looked almost shell-shocked. Outside, rain continued falling over Manhattan in heavy silver waves, washing reflected emergency lights across the streets below as news vans gathered around Dalton Global headquarters downtown. Federal agents had already entered the building publicly. Cable networks replayed footage of Richard Dalton standing frozen inside the ballroom beside Olivia, while headlines screamed about hidden offshore accounts, falsified earnings reports, and the collapse of one of America's most admired corporate empires. In less than 3 hours, Richard Dalton transformed from billionaire success story into the face of one of the largest financial scandals in recent memory. And somewhere above the chaos, inside a dimly lit private hotel bar hidden near the upper floors of the Grand Regency, Richard finally sat alone for the first time all night. Jessica Mercer was gone. According to hotel staff interviewed later, she left nearly 40 minutes earlier after receiving a private call from her brother Daniel. Witnesses claim she attempted speaking to Richard briefly before leaving, but he barely acknowledged her. By then, the panic surrounding Dalton Global had already become impossible to contain. Investors were fleeing. Attorneys stopped returning calls. Multiple board members reportedly prepared resignation statements before midnight. Richard remained seated near the back of the bar, staring silently through rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan while untouched whiskey rested beside him. The television above the counter replayed financial coverage of his collapse repeatedly, though the volume remained muted. Every screen displayed the same image eventually. Olivia standing calmly beneath chandelier light, while America watched Richard Dalton's empire unravel in real time. Then Olivia entered the bar. No security announcement. No dramatic entrance. Just silence. Richard looked toward her slowly as she crossed the room wearing the same dark wine-colored gown from the gala, though now the atmosphere around her felt entirely different. Less like triumph, more like exhaustion carefully hidden beneath control. She approached the table without hesitation and sat across from him quietly while rain tapped softly against the windows surrounding them. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. This was not the billionaire CEO and the quiet ex-wife anymore. This was two people sitting alone, inside the ruins of 20 years together. Richard looked older suddenly, smaller somehow. The arrogance that once filled every room around him had cracked open beneath the weight of humiliation, betrayal, and realization all arriving at once. For the first time in decades, there were no cameras left to impress, no investors left to manipulate, no board members left to intimidate, only silence. Finally, Richard spoke. Was any of it real? His voice sounded rougher than expected, almost unrecognizable compared to the polished confidence audiences heard during interviews for years. The question itself hung heavily between them because it carried far more than one meaning. Richard was not only asking about the investigation or the hidden identity or the years of secrets surrounding her name. He was asking about everything. The marriage, the late nights building Dalton Global together, the apartment in Chicago, the moments when she held him through panic attacks before investor meetings, the years before wealth poisoned him completely. Richard needed to know whether any part of the life they built together actually belonged to them at all. Olivia remained silent for several seconds. Then she looked at him carefully and answered in the calmest voice imaginable. The only thing fake was the version of me you chose to see. The words landed harder than any public accusation from earlier that night. Because deep down, Richard understood immediately that she was right. He spent years reducing Olivia into something easier for his ego to manage. Quiet, passive, invisible. He convinced himself she lacked ambition because she did not chase attention the way he did. He interpreted emotional restraint as weakness because arrogance blinded him from recognizing discipline. Even when clues surrounded him constantly, the family crest, the encrypted files, the private calls, the intelligence behind every conversation, Richard ignored them because acknowledging Olivia's true depth would force him to confront his own insecurities. And for the first time in the entire story, Richard finally admitted it aloud. I always knew you were smarter than me. The confession barely rose above the sound of rain outside. Olivia said nothing. Richard stared down into the untouched whiskey beside him before continuing slowly, as though speaking truths he buried for years beneath success and ego. When we first met in Chicago, you solved problems I couldn't even understand yet. Investors listened to me because I knew how to speak. But you, he paused weakly, you were always the one who actually saw the whole board. Another long silence settled between them. Richard leaned back heavily against the chair and laughed once under his breath, though there was no humor left in it anymore. I think I spent 20 years trying to become powerful enough to stop feeling inferior around you." That sentence changed the atmosphere completely. Because villains become far more human when they finally expose the fear underneath their cruelty. Richard Dalton did not destroy his marriage simply because he became greedy. He became addicted to admiration, because admiration temporarily silenced the insecurity he carried for years beside a woman whose intelligence and emotional control quietly surpassed his own. The fame, the interviews, the younger mistress, the obsession with status, all of it became armor protecting a fragile truth Richard never admitted publicly until now. Somewhere deep inside himself, he feared Olivia never truly needed him at all. Olivia looked toward the rain-covered windows before answering softly. "I did need you once." Richard closed his eyes briefly. That hurt him more than the investigation, more than the scandal, more than losing billions, because it confirmed something he suspected too late. There was a time when Olivia genuinely loved him enough to build a life beside him without revealing the full truth about who she was. And then Olivia delivered the final blow. "I was going to save you." Richard looked up immediately. For the first time all night, genuine emotion flickered visibly across Olivia's face. Not anger, sadness. She explained quietly that years earlier, when she first discovered the deeper financial corruption forming inside Dalton Global Holdings, she initially believed Richard could still pull himself back before crossing irreversible lines. She protected him repeatedly behind the scenes without him realizing it. Certain investigations disappeared because of her influence. Certain investors remained silent because of private conversations she arranged quietly. She even used her family's connections discreetly to shield Dalton Global during moments when federal scrutiny first started approaching the company years earlier. Richard stared at her in disbelief. "You protected me." Olivia nodded once. "But your arrogance made you dangerous." The room fell silent again, because that was the true tragedy hiding beneath the scandal. Richard Dalton was not destroyed by Olivia's revenge. He was destroyed because the one person capable of saving him eventually realized he had become too blinded by ego to save at all. Outside the hotel windows, Manhattan continued glowing beneath cold rain while financial news networks broadcast the collapse of Richard's empire across the country. But inside that quiet bar above the city, none of it seemed as devastating as the realization slowly settling between them both. Richard Dalton spent 20 years believing Olivia stood quietly behind him because she depended on his power. Only now did he finally understand the truth. She stayed because she loved the man he used to be before power convinced him he no longer needed her. In the weeks following the collapse of Dalton Global Holdings, Manhattan moved on the way powerful cities always do. Another scandal replaced the last one. Another billionaire appeared on magazine covers. Another company rose while another quietly burned beneath headlines and lawsuits. But for Richard Dalton, life did not continue forward so easily. The speed of his downfall stunned even the people who once hated him. Within 48 hours of the Blackstone Legacy Gala, federal investigators officially froze multiple Dalton Global accounts tied to offshore subsidiaries connected to the growing fraud investigation. Trading on company stock was halted temporarily after shares collapsed beyond recovery. Several longtime board members resigned publicly while denying prior knowledge of internal financial misconduct. Cable news analysts who once praised Richard as a visionary now debated how long the deception had truly existed beneath his empire. Former employees began leaking stories anonymously about intimidation, manipulation, and hidden financial pressure inside Dalton Global for years. By the end of the month, Richard Dalton's name had transformed from a symbol of ambition into a warning. The social collapse happened even faster. People who once fought for invitations to Richard's private dinners suddenly stopped answering his calls entirely. Elite investors avoided being photographed near him publicly. Luxury clubs quietly revoked access. Several charities removed his name from donor boards within days after the scandal exploded across national media. According to one former associate, Richard attended a high-profile financial event nearly 2 months later and spent almost the entire evening standing alone while conversations shifted awkwardly whenever he approached. The humiliation cut deeper because Richard had built his identity entirely around status and admiration. Without them, he looked strangely hollow. Paparazzi photographs taken during that period showed him walking through Manhattan alone wearing dark coats and baseball caps. Avoiding cameras while legal teams fought mounting investigations tied to Dalton Global's financial collapse. Reporters later described him as visibly aged compared to the confident billionaire who entered the Grand Regency ballroom believing the world still belonged to him. Jessica Mercer disappeared from public view almost immediately after the gala. For weeks, gossip outlets attempted tracking her whereabouts unsuccessfully. Rumors spread that she moved temporarily overseas after federal investigators questioned multiple Dalton Global executives connected to offshore transactions. Others claimed she quietly separated herself from Richard entirely, the same night Olivia revealed her real identity publicly. What remained undeniable was this: the glamorous future Jessica imagined beside Richard Dalton vanished overnight beneath scandal and public humiliation. The same elite circles she once desperately tried entering now treated her like a ghost connected to a financial disaster nobody wanted attached to their reputation. In many ways, Jessica became another casualty of Richard's arrogance. She gambled her future on a man obsessed with power, and failed to recognize that Olivia, the woman she mocked privately for years, understood the entire game long before any of them did. But perhaps the most unexpected part of the story was Olivia herself. People anticipated revenge, public celebrations, interviews humiliating Richard further, best-selling memoirs exposing secrets from inside the marriage. Instead, Olivia Van Alder disappeared quietly from public attention almost as suddenly as she entered it. Aside from one brief statement released through attorneys confirming cooperation with federal investigators, she refused nearly every interview request offered afterward. Financial networks spent months trying to secure appearances from her unsuccessfully. Even journalists researching the Van Alder family struggled uncovering meaningful details about her private life after the gala because the family remained extraordinarily protected from public exposure. The mystery surrounding Olivia only deepened public fascination with her story. Then, almost 6 months after Dalton Global officially filed for bankruptcy restructuring, Olivia appeared publicly once again under circumstances nobody expected. Not at a corporate conference, not inside a courtroom, at a small community education center in Chicago, the same city where Richard once met her decades earlier before fame and wealth consumed his life. There were no cameras initially, no red carpets, no billionaire investors standing nearby. Olivia quietly announced the launch of the Van Alder Foundation for Financial Ethics and Recovery, an organization dedicated to helping victims of corporate fraud rebuild savings, businesses, and retirement security after financial exploitation. According to later interviews with staff members, Olivia personally insisted the foundation remain focused on ordinary people rather than publicity. Retired couples who lost pensions, small business owners destroyed by hidden investment schemes, employees blindsided when corporations collapsed beneath executive corruption. In private conversations, several people close to the foundation later admitted Olivia seemed far more emotionally affected by the damage Dalton Global caused ordinary workers than by Richard's betrayal itself. That detail mattered deeply to audiences following the story. Because Olivia, never behaved like someone celebrating revenge. She never mocked Richard publicly, never humiliated him in interviews, never positioned herself as a triumphant victim. Instead, she carried herself with a calm maturity that made the tragedy feel even heavier. Older audiences especially connected with that restraint because life experience teaches something younger people often misunderstand. The deepest pain rarely screams loudly. Sometimes it simply changes shape quietly and keeps moving forward. Meanwhile, Richard remained trapped inside the ruins of the world he built around himself. According to reports later leaked from former associates, he attempted rebuilding smaller investment partnerships privately after the scandal, but almost nobody trusted him anymore. Legal investigations continued dragging forward, while civil lawsuits from investors consumed enormous portions of his remaining wealth. Some former employees claimed Richard occasionally visited Chicago alone during that period, spending hours driving through neighborhoods connected to the early years of his marriage with Olivia. Whether he hoped for closure or simply wanted to remember who he used to be before power transformed him completely, nobody knows. But people who encountered Richard during those years described the same thing repeatedly. Regret. Not only regret over losing his company, regret over losing himself. Because somewhere beneath the headlines about fraud, offshore accounts, shell corporations, and billion-dollar scandals existed a far simpler tragedy hiding underneath everything else. Richard Dalton once had someone beside him who loved him before success distorted his identity. Someone intelligent enough to help build his future while remaining invisible to the world. Someone patient enough to protect him repeatedly, even after recognizing the dangerous man he was becoming. And he threw her away because his ego convinced him admiration mattered more than loyalty. Years later, people still debated whether Olivia planned everything from the beginning or whether Richard's arrogance slowly forced her hand over time. Some believed she married him undercover intentionally because of the Van Alder family's hidden interests in American finance. Others believed she genuinely loved him once and only turned against him after realizing how dangerous Dalton Global had become beneath his leadership. The truth likely existed somewhere in between, complicated and painfully human in ways neither side fully understood. But one fact remained undeniable. On the night Richard Dalton stood beneath crystal chandeliers watching billionaires rise respectfully for the woman he believed was weak, he finally understood something too late. Power is not always loud. Sometimes real power stays silent while everyone else underestimates it. And by the time people recognize the truth, the game is already over. In the end, Richard Dalton lost more than his company. He lost the only person who ever saw him before the money did. Even now, years after the collapse of Dalton Global Holdings, people still argue about the night Evelyn Olivia Van Alder stepped onto that stage inside the Grand Regency Ballroom and froze an entire room with her real name. Some believe Richard Dalton deserved every second of humiliation that followed. They point to the affair with Jessica Mercer, the arrogance, the insults during the divorce hearing, the way he dismissed Olivia publicly after she spent decades helping him build his empire from nothing. They believe Richard became so consumed by status and admiration that he stopped recognizing loyalty when it stood directly beside him. To those people, Olivia did not destroy Richard Dalton. She simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own decisions. But others see the story differently. Because beneath the fraud investigations, the offshore accounts, and the collapsing billion-dollar empire, there is still something deeply unsettling about Olivia herself. She hid her real identity for years. She investigated her husband secretly while continuing to stand beside him publicly. She copied files, built evidence quietly, and waited patiently while Richard unknowingly walked toward disaster. Some people believe she could have exposed the truth earlier. Others believe she manipulated the entire marriage from the beginning while hiding behind the image of a quiet wife nobody would ever suspect. Even now, financial analysts and journalists still debate whether Olivia entered Richard's life out of love, strategy, or something far more complicated resting somewhere between the two. And maybe that is why this story continues haunting people long after the headlines disappeared. Because most real betrayals are never completely clean. Richard Dalton was arrogant, selfish, and blinded by ego. But he was also a man who once loved Olivia before wealth changed him into someone harder, colder, and more dangerous. Olivia was intelligent, disciplined, and emotionally controlled. But she was also capable of hiding an entire identity from the person closest to her for decades without him ever fully understanding who she truly was. Neither of them walked away from the story untouched. One lost his empire publicly. The other lost the man she once believed he could become. And perhaps the most chilling part of all is how ordinary the beginning looked before everything collapsed. A marriage, shared dreams, late nights building a future together in a tiny apartment in Chicago. Two people trying to survive before money entered the picture and magnified every insecurity hiding beneath the surface. Stories like this force people to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, ambition, loyalty, and power, because almost nobody enters a relationship expecting secrets large enough to destroy entire lives later. So now the question becomes yours. Did Olivia go too far, or did Richard destroy himself? Would you forgive someone who underestimated you for years, while taking credit for everything you helped build? And if you discovered your partner had been hiding a secret life the entire time, would you stay? Or would that betrayal change everything forever? Let us know what you think in the comments below, because this story continues dividing people for one reason more than any other. Almost everyone watching can recognize a piece of themselves somewhere inside it. Richard Dalton spent most of his life believing power belonged to the loudest person in the room, the richest man at the table, the face on magazine covers, the billionaire stepping out of private jets while cameras flashed his name across television screens. But in the end, the person who brought his empire down was the same woman he stopped noticing years earlier. The quiet wife standing beside him while he chased admiration from strangers. The woman he mocked during a divorce hearing while she calmly protected page 6 of an agreement he never bothered to read carefully. The woman powerful men recognized instantly the moment her real name echoed through that ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers and gold light. And maybe that is the real lesson hidden inside this entire story. People rarely lose everything in a single night. Most downfalls happen slowly, one ignored warning at a time, one betrayal at a time, one moment of arrogance at a time, until eventually the person staring back at you in the mirror no longer resembles the version someone once loved before the money arrived. For Richard Dalton, that realization came too late. But for millions of people who watched his empire collapse in real time, the image they never forgot was not the stock market crash, or the federal investigation, or the billionaires leaving the ballroom in silence. It was the look on Richard's face the moment Olivia walked onto that stage, and he understood he had spent 20 years underestimating the most powerful person in his life. And if you think Richard's downfall was shocking, wait until you hear about the billionaire surgeon whose maid recognized him from a missing persons case 20 years earlier. That story begins with a locked basement door, a photograph hidden behind a hospital wall, and a secret so disturbing it forced an entire city to question whether one of America's most respected doctors had been hiding the truth in plain sight for decades. You do not want to miss that one. And don't forget to subscribe so that you won't miss any of our upcoming videos.